23 years after 3 police officers vanished into a Montana blizzard, their patrol car emerged from the earth like a ghost from the past. Rusted, empty, and hiding secrets that would shake a small town to its core. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. October 15, 2020, started like any other morning in Millbrook, Montana. Farm trucks rumbled down Main Street, their engines creating a familiar symphony that had echoed through this tight-knit community for generations. But at 9:47 a.m., everything changed. Marcus Webb, a surveyor mapping property boundaries, was trudging through thick brambles near the old Hartwell mine when his metal detector began screaming. The high-pitched wail cut through the autumn silence like a warning from the past. Marcus pushed aside decades of overgrowth. Wild roses with thorns like razors, twisted vines, and the musty smell of decomposing leaves. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. A patrol car, unmistakably official, bearing the faded markings of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. The vehicle sat partially buried, its white paint now rust-brown, windows spider-webbed with cracks, interior transformed into a nest for field mice and birds. Marcus's hands shook as he called 911. Within minutes, the quiet rural road exploded into chaos. Red and blue lights strobing, radio chatter crackling through the crisp air. Sheriff Patricia Coleman arrived first, her experienced eyes immediately recognizing what Marcus had found. She had been a rookie deputy in 1997, and she remembered that terrible December night when officers Jake Morrison, Tommy Santos, and Elena Vasquez had responded to a call near this very location. They had driven into a blizzard and simply vanished. The official report had concluded that the officers had likely died in the storm, their patrol car swept away by flooding, their bodies lost to the wilderness. The case had been closed after months of searching. Families had grieved. Life had moved on. But now, as Sheriff Coleman stared at the impossible sight before her, questions exploded in her mind. If the patrol car was here, buried deliberately beneath years of growth, then where were the officers? And more disturbing still, who had hidden this evidence, and why? The crime scene team worked methodically, their cameras flashing against the overcast sky. The car's position showed it had been carefully concealed, not randomly abandoned. Personal belongings were missing. No wallets, no badges, no weapons. There were no human remains, no clothing, no sign that 3 human beings had ever occupied this vehicle. But what really happened that night in December 1997? And what secrets had been buried along with that patrol car in the Montana wilderness? Eleanor Hartwell, the 78-year-old matriarch whose family had once owned the mine, watched the police activity from her farmhouse window. Her weathered hands gripped the windowsill as she observed the chaos unfolding on what had once been her family's property. As the sun set behind the mountains, one thing became crystal clear. The discovery of this patrol car wasn't the end of an old mystery. It was the beginning of something far more sinister than anyone in Millbrook could have imagined. 3 weeks after the discovery that shattered Millbrook's decades-old silence, a black SUV pulled into the town's only motel, carrying with it the promise of answers and the threat of exposure. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her vehicle, her camera equipment cases glinting in the pale November sunlight. At 45, she had built a reputation for diving deeper than other documentarians dared, her perfectionist nature driving her to uncover truths that others missed. But those who knew her well understood that her relentless pursuit of missing persons cases stemmed from a wound that had never healed. Her own father, a police officer, had vanished when she was 12. The Millbrook Motel's neon sign flickered weakly against the gray sky as Sarah checked in. Clerk Betty Morrison, Jake's aunt, studied Sarah's credit card with suspicious eyes. Word traveled fast in small towns, and everyone already knew why the filmmaker was here. "You're here about the patrol car," Betty said. Not a question, but an accusation wrapped in Montana politeness. Sarah nodded, her empathetic nature immediately sensing the pain beneath Betty's defensive tone. "I'm hoping to help find answers for the families." "Some answers are better left buried," Betty muttered, sliding the room key across the counter with more force than necessary. That evening, Sarah set up her equipment in the motel room, the soft hum of her laptop competing with the wind rattling the windows. She spread crime scene photos across the bed, images of the rusted patrol car, the deliberate concealment, the impossible emptiness where 3 lives should have left traces. Her first interview was scheduled for the next morning with Sheriff Coleman, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that 23 years of silence wouldn't be broken easily. As she reviewed her notes about Officers Morrison, Santos, and Vasquez, their faces stared back at her from old department photos, young, hopeful, unaware that one December night would erase them from existence. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like scattered stars, each one representing a potential witness, a keeper of secrets, or perhaps a guardian of the truth. But in a town where loyalty ran deeper than the mineral veins beneath their feet, would anyone be willing to speak? The wind howled through the darkness, carrying with it the whisper of a 23-year-old promise. Some secrets, once buried, fight to stay that way. December 18th, 1997. The blizzard that would change everything began as gentle snowflakes dancing in the headlights of Patrol Car 47. Officer Jake Morrison adjusted his radio, the static crackling through the vehicle's warm interior. Beside him, Tommy Santos checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. In the back seat, rookie Elena Vasquez reviewed her notes, her breath visible in small puffs as the heater struggled against the Montana cold. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, Jake's voice cut through the radio static. "We're approaching the Hartwell mine. No visual on any unusual lights yet." The call had come in an hour earlier. Eleanor Hartwell, voice shaky with age and concern, reported trespassers on her family's old mining property. Strange lights moving through the abandoned buildings, she'd said. Kids, probably. But with the holidays approaching, tensions in the community were already high. Tommy rolled down his window, letting in a rush of frigid air that carried the scent of pine and snow. "You hear that?" he whispered. Elena leaned forward. "Hear what?" "Exactly, nothing. No wind, no animals. Dead quiet." The mine's silhouette loomed ahead, its skeletal structures reaching toward the storm clouds like the ribs of some ancient beast. Jake guided the patrol car down the access road, tires crunching through snow that was falling heavier now, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. "There!" Elena pointed toward the main building. "I saw something." A light flickered in one of the mine's windows, not the random beam of flashlights, but steady, deliberate. Jake killed the engine and the 3 officers sat in the sudden silence, watching. "Could be electrical," Tommy suggested, but his hand instinctively moved to his service weapon. Elena checked her notepad one final time. Over the past weeks, she'd been tracking something troubling: financial irregularities in the department, unexplained payments, late-night meetings she wasn't supposed to know about. Tonight felt different, important, like pieces of a puzzle were finally aligning. "Let's check it out," Jake said, opening his door. The wind hit them immediately, snow swirling like tiny daggers in the darkness. They approached the mine office, their flashlights cutting weak paths through the blizzard. The building's door stood slightly ajar, creaking on rusted hinges. Jake pushed it open, weapon drawn. "Police, anyone in here?" But what really happened in those final moments? What did the 3 officers discover that cold December night that would lead to their disappearance and 23 years of silence? The only witness to their fate was the storm itself. And storms, like secrets, eventually pass, leaving behind only traces of what once was. Sheriff Coleman's office felt smaller than it looked, the walls closing in as Sarah set up her camera equipment. 23 years of law enforcement had taught Coleman to read people, and she could see the determination burning behind Sarah's calm exterior. The official report stated the officers died in flooding. Sarah began, her voice steady but her eyes searching. But the patrol car was found on high ground, deliberately concealed. Coleman shifted in her chair, fingers drumming against her desk. Storms can be unpredictable. Maybe someone moved the vehicle later. Who would do that? And why? The sheriff's pause lasted a beat too long. Look, Ms. Mitchell, that was a chaotic night. The blizzard knocked out power lines, flooded the main road. We had multiple emergencies across the county. But Sarah's perfectionist nature had already caught the inconsistency. She pulled out a weather report from December 1997, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. According to the National Weather Service, the flooding occurred 3 miles south of the mine. The patrol car was found northeast, uphill from any water source. Coleman's jaw tightened. Memory can be unreliable after so many years. What about Eleanor Hartwell's call that night? She reported trespassers, but the dispatch log shows she mentioned unusual lights. That detail was omitted from the final report. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Sarah could feel she was approaching something important, like a surgeon finding the edge of a hidden tumor. Coleman stood abruptly, ending the interview. Some details get lost in translation. 3 good officers died that night, and their families deserve respect, not conspiracy theories. As Sarah packed her equipment, she noticed Coleman's hands trembling slightly. Fear? Guilt? Or simply the weight of carrying a secret for 23 years? Outside the sheriff's station, Sarah reviewed her footage. Coleman's body language screamed deception. The avoided eye contact, the defensive postures, the way she'd ended the interview when pressed about specifics. But if the official story was a lie, what really happened that December night? And how many people in Millbrook knew the truth? The first crack had appeared in the wall of silence. Now Sarah had to decide how hard to push before the entire structure came crashing down. The Hartwell farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel against the Montana sky, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of decades and secrets. Sarah's boots crunched through frost-covered grass as she approached the front door, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter morning air. Eleanor Hartwell answered on the third knock, her 78-year-old frame fragile, but her eyes still sharp as winter steel. She studied Sarah through the screen door, decades of rural caution evident in her hesitation. "You're the filmmaker," Eleanor said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to talk about the night you called the police." Eleanor's weathered hands gripped the doorframe. "I already told them everything back then." But Sarah had learned to read the spaces between words, the pauses that revealed more than statements. "Mrs. Hartwell, you mentioned unusual lights in your original call. What exactly did you see?" The old woman's composure cracked slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. "Just lights where there shouldn't have been any. The mine's been closed for 15 years. Did you recognize any vehicles? Anyone who might have been meeting there?" Eleanor stepped back, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There were things happening at that mine. Business dealings I wasn't supposed to know about. My late husband, he—" She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before revealing too much. "Mrs. Hartwell, 3 officers are missing. If you know something—" "Those boys weren't the first to disappear around here," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying a tremor that wasn't entirely from age. "Sometimes people find it's better to start fresh somewhere else." The words hung in the cold air like an accusation. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Was Eleanor suggesting the officers had left voluntarily? "What do you mean by that?" But Eleanor was already retreating into her house, the screen door creating a barrier between truth and silence. Some questions are better left unasked, child. Some answers change everything. As Sarah walked back to her car, Eleanor's cryptic words echoed in her mind. If the officers hadn't died in the storm, if they had somehow chosen to disappear, then everything about this case was more complex than anyone imagined. But why would three dedicated officers abandon their lives, their families, their sworn duty? What could have been worth such a devastating choice? Maria Santos clutched her coffee cup with trembling hands, steam rising between her and Sarah like a veil of memories. 23 years hadn't dulled the pain in her eyes, the look of someone who had never stopped waiting for answers. Elena was my roommate for 8 months before she... Maria's voice broke. She was investigating something at the department, said there were payments that didn't add up. Sarah leaned forward, her empathetic nature sensing the weight of secrets Maria had carried alone. What kind of payments? Cash transfers, always at night, always off the books. Elena found records hidden in Deputy Chief Morrison's files. Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. Ah, she was building a case. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Morrison, Jake's father, had been in charge of the initial investigation into his own son's disappearance. The conflict of interest was staggering. Did Elena tell anyone else about this? Maria shook her head. She didn't trust anyone at the station. Said the corruption went too deep. The night she disappeared, she was planning to take everything to the state police. Sarah's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle that grew more disturbing with each revelation. Do you know what these payments were for? Land deals, she thought. Someone was buying up property around the mine for pennies on the dollar. Families were losing their farms, and somehow certain people always knew which properties were about to default. The pattern was becoming clear. A conspiracy of insider information, financial manipulation, and strategic acquisitions. But if Elena had discovered this scheme, it provided a powerful motive for silencing her and her partners. Maria, did Elena leave any evidence behind? Files, documents, anything? Maria's eyes darted toward the window, fear replacing grief in her expression. I kept some of her things, hidden them all these years, afraid to come forward. But maybe... She hesitated. Maybe it's time. As Sarah waited for Maria's decision, she realized they were approaching the point of no return. Elena's evidence could expose decades of corruption, but it would also put Maria, and Sarah herself, in danger. But some truths are worth the risk. Some secrets demand to be told, no matter the cost. The storage unit's metal door rolled up with a screech that echoed through the cold afternoon air. Maria stepped inside, her movements careful and deliberate, as if disturbing sacred ground. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in Elena's neat handwriting, an archive of a life cut short. "Sir, I couldn't bear to throw anything away," Maria whispered, pulling down a box marked Work Files, Personal. The police never asked for her personal belongings. Maybe they didn't want to find what she'd discovered. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she opened the box. Inside, manila folders contained photocopied bank records, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings about farm foreclosures. Elena's methodical nature was evident in every organized page. Dates cross-referenced, amounts circled in red ink, patterns highlighted in fluorescent yellow. "Look at this," Sarah breathed, holding up a document. Copper Ridge Ranch, foreclosed December 1997. Mountain View Farm, foreclosed November 1997. Pine Valley Acres, foreclosed January 1998. Maria peered over Sarah's shoulder. "Salty!" All around the same time, the officers disappeared. But it was the next document that made Sarah's blood run cold. A geological survey report, dated October 1997, showing significant copper deposits beneath the Hartwell mine property and surrounding farmland. Someone had known about the mineral wealth before the foreclosures began. Elena figured it out, Sarah realized, her voice barely audible. Someone was forcing farmers into bankruptcy so they could buy the land cheap, knowing it contained millions in copper. In Elena's final notes, dated December 17th, one day before the disappearance, she had written, "Meeting arranged for tomorrow night. J&T agreed to confront source. Evidence must reach state authorities regardless of outcome." The implications were staggering. The three officers hadn't stumbled into danger. They had walked into it deliberately, knowing the risks, but determined to expose the truth. They were heroes, Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. But heroes, Sarah knew from bitter experience, don't always survive their noble intentions. Sometimes they simply vanish into Montana blizzards, leaving behind only questions and the hope that someone, someday, would care enough to seek answers. As they packed Elena's evidence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In a conspiracy this deep, this well-organized, how many eyes were still protecting 23-year-old secrets? The abandoned Hartwell mine stood against the winter sky like a monument to forgotten dreams. Sarah approached the main office building, Elena's files tucked securely in her backpack, the weight of evidence heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. The building's door hung askew, its hinges rusted from decades of Montana weather. Inside, broken glass crunched under Sarah's boots as she navigated through debris and animal droppings. Shafts of pale sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing in the cold air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. But it was beneath the rotted floorboards where Sarah made her most chilling discovery. Elena's personal notebook lay wrapped in plastic, hidden in a makeshift compartment that had protected it from 23 years of rain and snow. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the water-stained pages, Elena's handwriting still legible despite the passage of time. December 17, 1997. Final meeting arranged. Morrison Sr. involved. Conflict of interest, compromising investigation. Hartwell family receiving payments through Shell Company. Total mineral rights worth estimated $47 million. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. This wasn't just about a few corrupt officials. It was about an entire network designed to steal generational wealth from farming families. Elena's last entry sent chills down Sarah's spine. If something happens to us, the evidence is hidden where it all began. Trust no one in uniform. The corruption goes to the top. As Sarah photographed each page, her camera flash illuminated another detail that made her blood run cold. Footprints in the dust, fresh ones, leading directly to where Elena's notebook had been hidden. Someone else had been here recently. Someone who knew exactly where to look. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Some secrets should stay buried. Leave town while you still can. The message sent terror racing through her veins. 23 years later, the conspiracy was still active, still protecting itself, still willing to silence anyone who came too close to the truth. But Elena's courage, preserved in ink and determination, gave Sarah strength. If 3 young officers could risk everything for justice, then she could honor their sacrifice by finishing what they'd started. The mine's shadows seemed to whisper warnings, but Sarah had learned that some fears must be faced, regardless of the consequences. David Hartwell's law office occupied the most prestigious corner of Millbrook's main street, its mahogany furniture and leather-bound books projecting an image of respectability that had served his family for 3 generations. But when Sarah entered unannounced, she saw something else in his carefully composed features. Fear. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid I can't discuss family business," David said, not offering her a seat. His hands fidgeted with an expensive pen, the only sign of his nervousness. "Your grandmother called the police that night. She saw something at the mine that made her afraid." Sarah's voice remained calm, but her eyes never left his face. "What was she protecting?" David's composure cracked slightly. "My grandmother is an elderly woman with failing memory. Her testimony isn't reliable. But the mineral survey is." Sarah placed a copy of Elena's evidence on his desk. $47 million in copper deposits. Your family knew about them before the foreclosures began. The color drained from David's face as he stared at the documents. His grandfather's signature was clearly visible on contracts dated months before the supposed discovery of the mineral wealth. "You don't understand the pressure we were under," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The mining companies? The political connections? Refusal wasn't an option. Sarah leaned forward, sensing the moment when secrets begin spilling like water through a cracked dam. What happened to the three officers, David? They were supposed to be reasonable. We offered them enough money to disappear, start new lives somewhere else. It was supposed to be simple, clean. His voice carried the weight of 23 years of guilt. But they refused? David's silence stretched like a taut wire. Finally, he spoke. Elena wouldn't take the money. Said she had a duty to the families who'd lost their farms. Jake and Tommy, they stood by her. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The officers hadn't died in the blizzard. They had been eliminated because they couldn't be bought. Where are they buried, David? But before he could answer, his office door burst open. Deputy Chief Morrison stood in the doorway, his hand resting on his service weapon, his eyes cold with decades of practiced intimidation. "I think this conversation is over," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been questioned. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized she had pushed too far, too fast. In a town where corruption had roots deeper than the mine shafts themselves, the truth was a dangerous weapon that could destroy anyone who wielded it. The black SUVs arrived in Millbrook like storm clouds, their tinted windows reflecting the pale winter sun as they parked outside Sarah's motel. Agent Rebecca Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle, her FBI credentials gleaming in the cold morning light. "Ms. Mitchell, we need to discuss your investigation," Torres said, her tone professional but urgent. "You've uncovered something that intersects with a federal case we've been building for years." Sarah's mind raced as she invited the agent into her motel room. Elena's evidence still spread across the small table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Federal case? Mineral rights fraud, tax evasion, racketeering. The Hartwell conspiracy is just one tentacle of something much larger. Torres studied the documents with practiced eyes. "How much of this have you made public?" "Nothing yet. But David Hartwell was about to tell me where the officers are buried when Morrison interrupted." Torres's expression darkened. "Morrison is under surveillance. We believe he's been facilitating similar schemes across 3 states, using his law enforcement position to intimidate witnesses and bury evidence." The scope of the corruption was staggering. What Sarah had thought was a local conspiracy was actually part of a multi-state criminal enterprise, with connections reaching into federal agencies and major mining corporations. "We can offer you protection," Torres continued, "but we need your cooperation. The evidence you've gathered could be the key to dismantling the entire network." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. 3 young officers had died trying to expose this corruption, and now she held the power to either honor their sacrifice or become another casualty of the conspiracy's reach. What about the families? They deserve to know what happened to Jake, Tommy, and Elena. They will. But if we move too quickly, if the conspiracy realizes how much we know, evidence will disappear and witnesses will be silenced. We need to be strategic. Through her motel window, Sarah could see Morrison's patrol car parked across the street, the deputy chief's silhouette visible behind the wheel. He was watching, waiting, calculating his next move. But what Morrison didn't know was that the federal net was already closing around him. 23 years of careful planning was about to unravel, and this time there would be nowhere left to hide. The question was whether Sarah would live long enough to see justice served, or if she would join the officers in whatever unmarked grave held their remains. The cancer had been eating away at Eleanor Hartwell for months, but it was guilt that had consumed her soul for 23 years. When Sarah arrived at the hospital, she found the elderly woman propped against white pillows, her once sharp eyes now clouded with morphine and the weight of approaching death. "I called you here because I'm tired of carrying this alone," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of medical monitors. "Those 3 young people? They deserved better than what we gave them." Sarah activated her recording device with trembling fingers, sensing that this moment would change everything. "Mrs. Hartwell, what really happened that night?" Eleanor's weathered hand gripped Sarah's with surprising strength. "My husband discovered that the officers knew about the mineral rights. Elena had traced the money back to our family's shell companies. They were going to expose everything." The confession poured out like water from a broken dam. The meeting at the mine hadn't been a confrontation. It had been a trap. The officers arrived expecting to gather final evidence, but instead found themselves surrounded by men who had too much to lose. Henry offered them money, new identities, a chance to disappear quietly. But that young woman, Elena, she wouldn't listen, said she had sworn an oath to protect the community, not exploit it. Eleanor's breathing became labored as she continued. When they refused, Henry said there was no choice. The mining contracts were worth more than 3 lives. Morrison helped, said it was necessary for the greater good. The monitors began beeping more rapidly as Eleanor's distress increased. They didn't suffer. Henry promised me they didn't suffer. Quick, clean, professional. Then the blizzard covered the tracks. Sarah's own heart was pounding as the full horror of the murders became clear. "Where are they buried, Mrs. Hartwell?" The old copper shaft, northwest of the main building, sealed with concrete, marked with a surveyor's stake. Henry said no one would ever find them there. Eleanor's eyes focused on Sarah with sudden clarity. David's been paying their family's blood money for years. Anonymous payments, college funds for children, medical bills covered. He thought it would balance the scales somehow. As Eleanor's confession ended, Sarah realized she held the key to solving the case, but also the evidence that would destroy an entire community's foundation. Sometimes the truth doesn't set people free. Sometimes it just reveals how deeply they've been trapped all along. "Promise me," Eleanor whispered as her strength faded. "Promise me their families will finally know peace." The FBI excavation team arrived at dawn, their equipment creating a stark contrast against the Montana wilderness. Agent Torres coordinated the operation, while Sarah watched from behind yellow tape, her documentary camera capturing every moment of the search that had taken 23 years to begin. The surveyor's stake stood exactly where Eleanor had described, a rusted metal post barely visible among the winter weeds. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what everyone already knew but dreaded to see. 3 distinct shapes buried beneath decades of concrete and earth. "We've got them," Torres announced, her voice carrying both triumph and sorrow. The careful excavation began, each shovelful of dirt bringing them closer to answers that had eluded justice for too long. Sarah found herself thinking about the families, Jake's parents, who had never stopped hoping for their son's return, Tommy's mother, who still set an extra place at Christmas dinner, Elena's sister, who had named her daughter after an aunt she would never meet. The first remains emerged wrapped in plastic, preserved by the cold and the sealed environment. Personal effects confirmed what DNA testing would later prove. Officer Elena Vasquez, age 24, still wearing the badge she had died trying to honor. By afternoon, all 3 officers had been recovered. The concrete tomb that was meant to hide their murders forever had instead become a time capsule, preserving not just their remains, but also evidence of their killers' identities. Morrison watched the excavation from his patrol car, his face a mask of resignation. He knew that Eleanor's deathbed confession, combined with the physical evidence now being catalogued, would destroy the careful lies he had helped construct. As the coroner's van pulled away with its tragic cargo, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice was finally possible, but it came at the cost of destroying a community's faith in its institutions and leaders. The 3 officers who had vanished into a Montana blizzard were finally coming home, but their return would forever change the town they had sworn to protect. Sometimes solving a mystery only reveals how much has been lost to the lies meant to hide it. What had started as the discovery of an abandoned patrol car had become the unraveling of a conspiracy that reached from local government to federal agencies. But most importantly, it had restored the dignity of three young people who had chosen death over dishonor, truth over treasure. Their final victory would be written in courtrooms and headlines, but their real triumph was simpler. They would finally be remembered as the heroes they had always been. The federal courthouse in Helena was packed with reporters, family members, and residents of Millbrook as Deputy Chief Morrison was led away in handcuffs. His conviction on charges of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy had taken 8 months to secure. But the evidence Sarah uncovered had made the outcome inevitable. David Hartwell had negotiated a plea deal, his cooperation helping federal prosecutors dismantle the entire mineral rights conspiracy. 12 other officials across 3 states faced similar charges, their decades-long scheme finally exposed by the courage of 3 young officers and the determination of one filmmaker. Sarah stood in the courthouse steps, microphones thrust toward her as reporters shouted questions about her documentary. But her focus was on the families in the crowd. Jake's elderly parents, finally able to grieve properly. Tommy's children, now understanding why their father never came home. Elena's sister, clutching the badge that had been recovered from the burial site. Elena Vasquez, Jake Morrison, and Tommy Santos died because they refused to let corruption flourish in their community, Sarah told the assembled media. Their sacrifice reminds us that some principles are worth more than life itself. The monetary settlements were substantial. The federal government had seized millions in mining, assets to compensate the families who had lost their farms to the conspiracy. But no amount of money could restore 23 years of uncertainty and grief. As Sarah drove back to Millbrook for the final interviews of her documentary, she reflected on the cost of truth. Morrison would spend his remaining years in federal prison. David Hartwell's family legacy was destroyed. The town's faith in its institutions would take generations to rebuild. But in the Millbrook Cemetery, 3 new headstones stood in the morning sunlight, their polished granite reflecting the Montana sky. The officers had finally received the honors denied to them for over 2 decades. Full police funerals, flag-draped caskets, and the recognition that they had died in the line of duty. Sarah's documentary would air nationwide, telling their story to millions. But the real victory was smaller, more personal. 3 families could finally say goodbye to the young people they had lost, and a community could begin the long process of healing from the lies that had poisoned it for too long. Justice had been served, but like all true victories, it came at a price that made celebration feel bittersweet. Some wounds never fully heal. They just stop bleeding long enough for new growth to begin. 2 years after the convictions, Sarah returned to Millbrook for the dedication of a small memorial park built where the Hartwell mine once stood. The copper beneath the ground would remain untouched, a decision made by the new town council to honor the officers who had died protecting their community from exploitation. The memorial bore 3 bronze plaques, each carrying the photograph and story of Officer Elena Vasquez, Officer Jake Morrison, and Officer Tommy Santos. Children played on nearby swings while their parents read the inscriptions, ensuring that future generations would know the price of their freedom from corruption. Eleanor Hartwell had died 6 months after her confession, taking with her the last of the old guilt. Her grandson David served 3 years in federal prison and now worked quietly as a paralegal in a neighboring county, his family name forever changed by the choices of previous generations. Sarah's documentary had won awards and sparked investigations into similar conspiracies across the country. But standing in the peaceful park, she understood that the real victory wasn't in the accolades or the justice served. It was in the simple fact that truth had finally triumphed over decades of lies. Her own father's case remained unsolved, but Sarah had found a different kind of peace. Some mysteries resist solutions despite our desperate need for answers, but that doesn't diminish the value of seeking truth wherever it can be found. As the dedication ceremony ended, an elderly woman approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for bringing our children home," she whispered. It was Jake's mother, her face bearing the lines of 23 years of uncertainty finally resolved. The wind whispered through the memorial park, carrying with it the scent of prairie grass and the promise of seasons yet to come. The three officers who had vanished into a Montana blizzard had been transformed from victims into symbols, proof that courage echoes across decades, that justice delayed is not always justice denied. In the end, their greatest victory wasn't in death, but in the reminder they left behind. Some truths are worth any sacrifice, and heroes are measured not by how they die, but by what they're willing to die for. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one.